So, last lecture we were discussing women's long-term mate preferences. We were examining what traits women reported as being valuable in their partner. We were thinking about why the traits that women reported liking in their partner were valuable to them, and how those preferences could help discover which partners were most able and most willing to provide protection and provisioning for them and their dependent offspring, importantly, both now and in the future. Because when it comes to reproduction, women are going to produce offspring that are needy and dependent for many years. And so you don't necessarily just want a partner that's going to invest in you right now and not in the future. You want to have an eye towards how long this relationship's going to go. And as such, we saw that traits that positively correlated with the ability of a mate to access resources currently, access resources in the future, and those that signaled a willingness to preferentially invest those resources in their partner, as well as protect their partner from external threats. These were all traits that women were rating as highly valuable in prospective long-term partners. And so these include factors like access to current economic resources, a partner's ambition and industriousness, their interest and willing to work, their health, their strength, their size, their vitality, their level of energy, their intelligence, their emotional stability, their dependable characters, a slightly older age, how much they loved their partner, how kind they were, how positively interested they were in investing in children, and how compatible they were with a partner. We saw how women rate all these things as highly valuable and desirable in long-term mates, and why. And we also saw that as women commanded more resources themselves, that is, as women had more money, more economic pull, more social pull, as women raised in status, these same traits that women valued in a prospective partner, they remained the same, but what women did is they just raised their standards higher. That is, when women felt they were in a better position to not have to settle, their standards got higher rather than changing the things they valued. So if women value economic resources in a partner, as women get more economic resources themselves, they don't stop valuing the economic resources of a partner, but they want partners that now make even more money, have access to more resources. They want partners that are even more ambitious and higher in social status because they don't have to settle. And we also saw that as general standards of living increased, things in terms of national level, economics, healthcare, gender equality, life expectancy, as the general standards of life get better, the psychological sex differences between men and women actually also grow in size rather than diminish. That is, more stable life, better life, easier life. These things didn't make men and women more similar. They tended to make men and women more different. And that finding, in combination with the previous one we just talked about, where how women's standards increase as their access to resource and status grows, as that grows, their standards increase. This helps make the point that our mating preferences, both male and female mating preferences, should be expected to be rather context-specific. That is, they tailor themselves to current needs and opportunities. They are not context-independent. We don't always want the same thing. It depends on what we have access to right now. So in a simple example for this, if you rate people 1 to 5 in terms of attractiveness, which is a gross oversimplification, but for the sake of the example makes it easier. If you rate people 1 to 5 and you have someone who is a 5, it doesn't do this 5 very much good to try and pursue a 10. And this is because the 10 is unlikely to want to be in a relationship with the 5 because they have better options. And because they have better options, even if that 10 did settle for a 5 temporarily, the relationship is not going to be that stable because other opportunities will present themselves over time, which will encourage the 10 to switch a mate. So it doesn't really do the 5 much use to pursue the 10, and so you should expect their preferences and standards to change accordingly, suiting themselves to their contexts. So while we all have preferences and desires for different things in life, not all partners are equally appealing, the constraints of life prevent those preferences from being realized to varying degrees. And when someone's better off themselves, they're better able to translate their preferences into a reality. So if you want to buy a really nice, luxurious home, if you don't have the money to do it, well, you can't buy the home. Life is going to constrain your preferences. But if you're in a better position, i.e. you have more resources, you can manifest your preferences in life more readily and actually afford that larger home. The same logic applies to mating as well. And this is really important to note because much of the mating behaviors we see in life, the actual behaviors, may not actually be full expressions of desires and preferences, but rather reflect a compromise that results from the imposition of constraints by outside forces, by life. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to turn to the male side of the coin, since we examined female preferences last time, and see what types of adaptive, unique problems men have had to solve in long-term relationships, and what corresponding traits they tend to value in their partners. As we discussed last time, both men and women really value love in relationships. Both men and women really value intelligence and kindness in a partner. But there are some unique problems that men face, and their preferences will shift accordingly. However, before we start thinking about what specific traits men value, we should take a step back and consider the more general question, which is why do human males, at least, engage in long-term relationships in the first place, where they're going to invest heavily in a particular woman and her offspring? Indeed, the human male pattern of long-term mating is rather unusual for mammalian species in general. Most mammalian species do not invest in offspring if you're a male. And as we've discussed in previous lectures here, there are a couple reasons for this. One of which is that on a basic underlying level, females can be more assured of their relatedness to their offspring, and males are less assured of it owing to how fertilization takes place. That is, fertilization takes place internally in females, which means a woman is 100% positive that any offspring she gives birth to is related to her. This is not the case for males in general. Males always have some degree of uncertainty as to whether or not an offspring is theirs. And if the offspring is not theirs, investing in it represents a very maladaptive choice, generally speaking, because they are effectively investing in genetic strangers. And so it's for this reason we see that females in mammals breastfeed offspring. Females develop mammary glands and breastfeed their offspring, and males don't. Part of the reason for that is this underlying paternity uncertainty. Males just don't develop these corresponding adaptations. And similarly, as we noted last time, the largest rate limiter on male reproduction, that is what determines the upper ceiling of how much a male can reproduce, appears to be the number of female partners that they have access to. The more females a male mates with, the more offspring they can produce. And because the upper limit of male reproduction is so much higher than the upper limit of female reproduction, this also raises the very interesting question of why would a male be interested in foregoing other possible mateships, other partners, and invest exclusively in one female partner? Why would a male want to settle down in the first place? Why are they engaging in this long-term monogamous relationship at all, if they risk paternity uncertainty and they can potentially gain more reproductive opportunities by running out and having sex with more partners? So why would a male go for, as the saying would say, the old ball and chain? The answer to this question is no doubt multifaceted. There are a couple of reasons for why men might invest in long-term relationships, and we can pull some of those explanations out for an initial answer to the question of why do men get into long-term relationships. The first explanation for this, the first solution to this riddle, is that, as we saw last time, male investment is very attractive to female partners. Indeed, that was the topic of the entire last lecture. And this has been extremely well established across the world and time and place. Across decades, everywhere in the world, women value male investment. And as such, because women value male investment, this male investment is an attractive resource to prospective partners, and so a male's willingness to invest in a long-term context can help him both attract a partner in the first place, as well as attract a higher quality partner. So to again return to our simple number example here, if a man happens to be a 5, he'll be able to secure far fewer sexual partners than a male who is a 10. And this is evident from plenty of real-life examples. Last time we discussed Magic Johnson, for instance, who reported having sex with hundreds of different women every year for several years because he is a tall, athletic, rich, famous, high social status basketball player. Or we also saw in a previous example, elephant seals, where the largest males will secure large tracts of territory and something like 5% of the males will father 85% of the offspring. So if a woman is strictly interested in short-term mating contexts, it's completely possible for a small number of males to monopolize basically all the mating opportunities, which locks the entire rest of the male population out from accessing any mates at all. So as such, if you have a man who's a 5, and he can't compete with a 10, purely on the grounds of physical contests or genetic quality, this 5, rather than attracting no mates at all, may still be able to raise as attractive to prospective partners by offering something to them that the 10 does not. And in this case, that could well be long-term investment in a relationship. So that is the ability and willingness of a man to invest in a relationship in the long term can afford him opportunities to mate he might otherwise be completely locked out of. So returning to our point here about how life constrains preferences, male investment can represent something of a compromise. The males would rather not provide investment at all else being equal, but they must provide it in order to fulfill other preferences like attracting a mate in the first place. Another possible explanation, which is not mutually exclusive, for why men invest in long-term relationships is that this investment can significantly improve the chances that their own offspring are going to survive and thrive. That is, human offspring are born incredibly dependent on parental protection and provisioning for many years, and having multiple sources of protection and provisioning can dramatically improve the ability of that child to survive. And not just survive, but thrive in the future. So fathers are capable of passing on physical resources, social resources, informational benefits to their offspring. And so fathers investing in long-term relationships can represent a direct improvement in the viability of their genetic future. Provided a male can be relatively assured of his paternity, investing in the success of existing offspring can really provide a valuable route to their genetic success above and beyond that of investing that same time and energy in securing additional mates. So really you can think of this explanation as a quality versus quantity issue. By investing in long-term relationships, men can access mates in general when they might otherwise not be able to. They can access higher quality mates than if they were sticking to short-term contexts only, and by providing additional opportunities for the offspring they do produce to succeed in life where they otherwise might not. So these are all reasons why you might see that men get into long-term relationships in the first place. Now, in seeking out these long-term relationships, men do have their own set of adaptive problems to solve as well. The first and most important of these problems is to select a mate that is fertile. That is, a mate capable of producing offspring in general. And this is important because while male fertility does to some extent decline with age, as men get older, their fertility is impaired slightly. It's still generally the case that all men, from puberty until death, are capable of impregnating women. The same is not true of women. In humans, female fertility begins shortly after the onset of puberty. It peaks in her late teens to 20s, and then afterwards it begins to decline, usually after about 30. And it declines to the level that by about the age of 45, women's fertility tends to be low to the point that her ability to conceive any more children is unlikely. And by the age of 50, women's reproductive potential is close to absent. This is what we call menopause. Now, this creates a very important sex difference in mating psychology, as men need to solve a particular problem of fertility to a much greater degree than women do. Men need to assess which partners are likely to be the most fertile now and in the future, and their psychological mating preferences follow suit. So knowing that this problem exists, when men are selecting partners for long-term relationships, it should come as no surprise that age, the age of their partner, is a very important factor for men. Just as women the world over express a desire for partners that are slightly older than them, men consistently express a desire for younger partners. And the size of this sex difference in age preference also changes with age as well. With the male's age, I should say. That is, men in their 30s tend to report wanting partners that are about 5 years younger than them. If I'm 30, I'd want a partner that's about 25. Men in their 50s, by contrast, tend to want partners that are about 20 years younger. So if I'm 50, I might be more inclined to go for a partner that's about 30. And the most attractive women in every country the world over across time tends to be those that are in their prime reproductive years. That is, there's no culture in the world where old or very old women are rated as being more desirable than younger ones. In fact, this analysis yields another very interesting finding, which is that men don't always prefer women that are younger than them. Specifically, if you look at young men, that is, ages about 12 to 19, these men tend to rate women that are slightly older than them as being the most attractive, which again corresponds to the age during which women tend to be the most fertile. So as women's age corresponds to her fertility, this reversal of a typical male preference for age is understandable, because what the male preference is tracking is not age relative to me per se, but what it's tracking is age relative to fertility. So younger men find slightly older women more attractive because these slightly older women tend to be peak fertile. And older men tend to find much younger women the most attractive for exactly the same reason. This is a problem that women don't usually have to assess. Similarly, the physical appearance of a woman can also serve as a powerful cue to her fertility, and accordingly, to her attractiveness. So any physical trait that corresponds to a signal of youth or fertility can be picked up on by male psychological mechanisms, and these will create the output of making that woman appear more attractive. Psychologically, that's how it feels. So as was the case with women, men prefer partners who are physically healthy. Men and women both want partners who are physically healthy. And these include having traits like clear, unblemished skin, symmetrical features, the absence of any signs of infection. All these things are universally rated as attractive qualities in both men and women, and for exactly the same reason. Now, in women, there are other traits you can pick up on. One of them appears to be the quality of hair. That is, the quality and length of a woman's hair can usually serve as a cue for both a woman's current age and her health status. As women get older, the quality of their hair tends to decline. And for this reason, you might also notice that as women get older, more of them tend to adopt shorter haircuts, which is partially because if your hair is no longer signaling your desirability, in fact, if it's perhaps sending a poor signal of your desirability, it's better to remove that signal or minimize it rather than continue to send a bad one. And so women adopt shorter haircuts owing to the quality of their hair declining over time. However, there's also the matter of body shape. That is, men and women differ rather substantially in their distributions of bodily fats. Before puberty, men and women carry their body fat rather similarly. Whereas after puberty, women tend to carry more fat in their body than men, but also tend to carry more fat around their hips and thighs. And this distribution of fat yields this common hourglass figure, which you can see on the left here, where a woman's waist tends to be narrower than her hips. And this ratio of waist to hip tends to be about 0.65 to 0.8 for healthy women. Now, as it turns out, this waist-to-hip ratio in women is an important predictor of her fertility status across cultures. That is, women with lower waist-to-hip ratios tend to become pregnant more readily, become pregnant at younger ages, and are more likely to have successful pregnancies. They're less likely to encounter complications, for instance, when women's waist-to-hip ratio falls within this healthy range. Further, when a woman's waist-to-hip ratio increases because of either pregnancy, obesity, or starvation, this usually entails a rather striking reduction in a woman's fertility. Now, the most obvious of these is pregnancy. When a woman gets pregnant, the waist-to-hip ratio gets larger. It approaches 1, where her waist and her hips are similar sizes. And this corresponds to when a woman is pregnant, she cannot become pregnant again. Obesity is also associated with reductions in fertility as women as well, and also associated with an increase in her waist-to-hip ratio. Now, obesity is a bit less important to consider here because it was probably not a common feature of humans' evolutionary history. Obesity, especially widespread obesity, is a rather modern problem that we're encountering. And that's because right now we have a lot of access to consistent refined sugars, high-calorie foods, very processed foods. This is causing a bit of an obesity issue, which does have fertility consequences. But a more common complication that we would have encountered in our evolutionary history was starvation. And as it turns out, when women are starving, their fertility can drop off in a rather dramatic fashion as well. Indeed, during times like famine or when associated with anorexia, eating disorders, women often become infertile entirely. They can't produce offspring. And this is because their body would be unable to support the caloric requirements of a pregnancy. So when a woman is unable to store enough fat in her body to support a pregnancy adequately, she simply ceases to be fertile for a time. And correspondingly, when women are starving, their waist-to-hip ratio also increases because this distribution of fat that made for larger hips, when you're starving, that goes away. So your hips become narrower, and this becomes about the same size as your waist, and changes your body shape, and as it turns out, these thin body shapes are rated as less attractive by men. And this preference for bodily shape is actually rather deeply ingrained in our psychology. Some people would say, oh, that's modern marketing. People are tricking you into thinking that women with low waist-to-hip ratios are the attractive ones. This hourglass figure is attractive. That's all cultural. Well, it turns out, no, that's not the case. A, it's universally attractive the world and time over. But B, there are even people that are born blind, men who are born blind, if you give them effectively mannequins to run their hands over, women's bodies to touch, and ask them which of these bodies are the most attractive, even blind men rate women with low waist-to-hip ratios as being more attractive. That's just how powerful this preference seems to be. You don't even need necessarily visual input to find that shape attractive. That's how deeply ingrained it is. Now, because these cues to fertility that women can provide through their physical appearance, be they age, health, or waist-to-hip ratio, because of these cues that women can present, and because men face this adaptive problem of assessing fertility, and women don't encounter this problem as men as often, it should come as little surprise that men tend to rate the physical attractiveness of their partner as being a more important factor than women do. That is, over every time period surveyed, over every population examined, every country assessed, it's always been the case that men place a higher premium on the physical attractiveness of their partner than do women. Physical appearance is simply more important to men, as it's helping us solve this problem that women are not solving as consistently. Now, that's not to say that women don't value men's physical appearance, as we covered last time they do, but that men value the physical appearance more. And of course, that they value different things. Women value men who are tall and muscular. Men don't value women that are tall and muscular. Not generally, anyway. So what they value in terms of which physical traits they focus on differs, and the emphasis they place on those physical features also differs. And this is because the sexes are facing different problems, different adaptive problems, and you end up with different psychological mechanisms to solve them. And I'd also like to take this moment to talk a bit more broadly about physical attractiveness in general. As I've come across a lot of people in my life, I'm sure you have too, that would suggest to you that if you find someone attractive because of their physical appearance, you're somehow shallow. This is something you're not supposed to do. Physical attractiveness is this lesser trait that you shouldn't be paying as much attention to relative to all the other actually important stuff. And as our analysis in this lecture and the past one should help us understand, as well as several lectures prior to that, like the one about signaling, this idea that physical attractiveness is somehow unimportant or shouldn't matter is extremely ill-founded. Physical traits can signal all number of important characteristics, both now and in the future. In men, it can signal your ability to protect, provide, to be ambitious, to be motivated, to improve. In women, it can signal your fertility, in addition to those other motivations. In both sexes, attractiveness can signal health and genetic quality. And both sexes desire physically attractive partners for very good reasons. Now, of course, people do want to be appreciated for more than just their physical beauty. And this can be especially true of people who lack in the domain of physical beauty. That is, if one doesn't possess a trait that other people value, it probably serves that person well to try and downplay the importance of the thing they don't have. If people value attractiveness and you are not yourself particularly attractive, it probably doesn't do you many favors to run around and say, hey, physical attractiveness is so important, because you fall down in that department. And you don't want to call attention to that, and you don't want to be assessed on that. So they try and downplay the importance of these characteristics. So to suggest that physical attractiveness of others is just some inconsequential, silly thing that you shouldn't be assessing, to suggest that is basically nonsense. While people may not fully appreciate the reasons that our cognitive systems prefer these things, prefer physical attractiveness, while we may not understand the deeper, ultimate reasons for their existence, that doesn't mean they're without value. Physical attractiveness signals a lot that's very valuable. As we've also mentioned previously, today as well, men face the adaptive problem of paternity uncertainty, and females don't. A man can never be 100% sure that the child produced by his partner is actually his, whereas women can be assured they are related to their offspring directly. So because of this, in the context of long-term relationships, another sex difference emerges with respect to preferences for sexual histories. So there are two ways to look at this preference. The first of these is a male preference for chastity or virginity. How important is it to a man that his partner has not had sex with anyone before him? Men, more than women, tend to express a desire for their partner to have no sexual partners before them. However, the degree of this preference has clearly changed over time more so than others. That is, men may not be able to consistently find women that are, shall we say, chaste or virgins. And so the overall value placed on this has varied substantially across time and place, owing to things like the availability of effective contraception, economic systems, religiosity, a lot of different traits, a lot of different factors, rather, of the world affect the preference for this trait. And the preference for virginity is not particularly pronounced. It's not a major one. What is important to note, though, is that even though the strength of this preference may vary across time and across place, the overall direction of the sex difference here doesn't seem to shift. That is, even if people don't value virginity very highly, men tend to value it more so than women in a partner. It's more important to men that their partner be a virgin than it is to women that their partner be a virgin, even if it's not that important to either sex. But there's also another way of looking at this preference, which is the lesser extreme way, which is that when it comes to looking for a long-term partner, there is the matter of promiscuity. And specifically, promiscuity represents a major threat to paternity uncertainty. That is one of the best predictors of sexual infidelity. If someone's in a relationship, what the best predictor of whether someone's going to cheat appears to be their sexual permissiveness. That is, the more sexual partners a woman has had before marriage tends to be a good predictor of how likely she is to have an affair in a relationship. So men value sexual faithfulness in a relationship as among the most valuable traits in a partner, and with good reason. Affairs can represent years of lost time and investment in the offspring of another male. So just as a woman's reproductive potential is a valuable resource that they don't typically give away for free, women don't just sleep with people willy-nilly, a man's parental investment is also a valuable resource that they don't typically wish to give away for free, and they don't want to be deceived into providing this investment in another man's offspring. They're very interested in providing it in their own. Now, of course, this isn't to say that women relish partners who aren't sexually faithful. Absolutely not. Women do not care for sexually unfaithful partners. They dislike being cheated on, just as men dislike it. The thing is, men tend to dislike it more. In a very interesting study on this, I believe it was by David Schmidt and some colleagues, they analyzed the show Cheaters, which is supposed to be this hidden camera show where someone sees if their partner is going to cheat on them when presented with an attractive opportunity. And you can see the sex difference in the adaptive problems that men and women face when they confront their partner. That is, if a man is confronting his female partner and she's having an affair, the first question he tends to ask is, did you fuck him? Whereas if a woman is she's encountering her male partner who's having an affair, the question she often asks first is, do you love her? So women don't like infidelity, but they tend to not like it because of a possible divestment of resources, whereas men tend to dislike infidelity, but that's because it represents a threat to paternity certainty, and this leads to different psychological preferences for how sexually permissive you want your partner to be. Now, this is also a good moment to take a detour back to a distinction we talked about in previous lectures, And this is the distinction between proximate and ultimate causes of a behavior. So as a refresher, as you may recall here, a proximate cause is the immediate cause of a behavior, while the ultimate cause refers to the evolutionary function of why that proximate reaction occurs. So you might say, well, there's this modern world we have right now, and birth control is extremely available. You have IUDs, you have birth control pills, you have injections, you have condoms, you have lots of different ways that you can prevent pregnancy. And as such, if a woman is reliably using birth control, these casual affairs may not pose much, if any at all, risk to non-paternity. So why would men get upset if their partner is cheating but using birth control? So in this case, you have that link between affairs and extra pair offspring. That link is broken with modern contexts. So why are people still getting so emotional about this stuff? And the answer to why people are still getting so emotional is that the forces responsible, the evolutionary forces responsible for shaping the cognitive mechanisms in our head, these have operated over very long spans of history, and it's implicitly ingrained this connection between affairs and non-paternity, whether on a conscious or unconscious level. And some cognitive mechanisms in our brain, all they do is take in inputs and they spit out outputs, and they don't need to know why. So some parts of our brain act as if this connection still exists, even if that link has been broken by modern circumstances. The proximate functions of our psychology, of our cognitive mechanisms, are only reacting to certain inputs, like sexual affairs, and producing certain outputs, like anger or jealousy, regardless of whether that particular affair is going to produce any offspring. Evolution is a very slow process, and our minds have not been shaped for a world in which birth control exists. And for similar reasons, you're going to note that women that take birth control do not suddenly become unattractive to men sexually, despite the fact that their fertility falls off a cliff. Men and women will continue to have sex with each other while the woman is using birth control, and they have sex with each other, behaving as if this link between having sex and reproduction still exists. So on a proximate level and an immediate level, sex will still feel good, partners will still find each other attractive, and they'll still get upset about affairs despite this link, this ultimate link between sex and reproduction being broken by modern contexts. So even if one part of your brain may consciously understand that the chances of pregnancy are very low, if not completely absent because of modern contraceptives, another part of your brain really disagrees with that assessment and behaves as if that link still exists. These are two separate pieces. So our evolved cognitive mechanisms have been shaped by past environments, not current ones, and that's why this emotional anger still exists, and why people still find each other attractive and have sex while using birth control, defeating the ultimate purpose of the behavior. So now that we've examined some of men and women's preferences in long-term relationships, it's time to shift gears a bit and move towards short-term mating. Look at short-term contexts. After all, not all human mating takes place in long-term relationships. And this could be casual sex. This could be people having affairs outside of established relationships. This could be prostitution, and whatever other contexts you want to toss in there. So knowing what personality characteristics and physical traits tend to be important to men and women in long-term relationships, and why they value what they do, because of what adaptive problems they have to solve and how these things solve it, this can also help inform our thinking about how each sex should respond to short-term encounters, and why they might engage in them and what they might value when they do, because short-term contexts are not the same as long-term ones. So to return briefly to our simple Clark and Hatfield study, and this is the one where a stranger who's working for the researcher approaches someone else on a college campus that they would actually consider having sex with, and they say, I've noticed you're on campus, I think you're very attractive, would you like to either A, go on a date with me, or B, have sex with me. The results of this study give us a very general model for thinking about how each sex is going to respond to mating in the long and short term. Specifically, about half of the women that were offered a date from a man accepted, but 0% of the women that were offered casual sex accepted. And indeed, when they rejected offers for casual sex, they often did so aggressively and with disgust. Who do you think I am? What's wrong with you? Why are you asking me this? Conversely, about half of men also accepted offers for a date, but 75% of men accepted the offer for casual sex. And those who declined often did so apologetically or cited other obligations. I'd love to, but I'm busy tonight. Can you do tomorrow? I'd love to, but I'm in a relationship. Thank you for asking. It's very flattering. And what these findings highlight is that when women are considering short-term encounters, it looks like their preferences do shift in the direction of becoming more selective in certain regards. Men, on the other hand, they also shift their preferences, but in the opposite direction. Men become less selective in short-term contexts. And knowing what we do about parental investment theory, that is, how much required investment do males and females put into reproducing, this general pattern shouldn't be surprising, but it can also help us understand more about what each sex tends to get from the short-term encounters. Now, it's a very unfortunate side effect of studying short-term mating that it's just a difficult topic to do research on. And as we reviewed today, women's desirability as a long-term partner is affected by her tendencies towards or away from sexual promiscuity. And as people are often quite interested in making themselves look more desirable, there is some incentive to hide unflattering information about yourself. Similarly, when short-term encounters take place in the form of affairs, I'm in a relationship and I'm having sex with someone I'm not supposed to, both men and women have large interests in hiding this information. They don't want to confess to others that they are engaged in this short-term behavior, because this can harm or jeopardize existing relationships. So because of all these social issues that surround short-term mating, this can make honest inquiry into the topic something of a difficulty. So demonstrating this difficulty, there's a small, fun research finding that I want to mention briefly. It's from a 2003 paper by researchers Alexander and Fisher. And what they did in this study is they had about 200 male and female undergraduates, and they asked them to report on their sexual behavior and report on their sexual attitudes, and they did so in 3 different contexts. So they're asked the same questions, but in 3 different contexts. The first of these is when their responses might be seen by somebody else. So they're told, here's a survey, fill this out. Some people are going to be assessing your responses, and in the other room, someone is kind of sitting there within view that might see what they're filling out. In this context, men report an average of 3.7 opposite-sex partners, and women report an average of 2.6. So men said, on average, we have sex with 3.7 women in our life. And women are saying, on average, I've had sex with 2.6 men in my life. Something's wrong here. Mathematically, these averages need to be the same. So either the sample that we're looking at wasn't evenly distributed between men and women with respect to the number of sexual partners they have, a bit of random sampling error. They randomly sampled women that had fewer male partners, or randomly sampled men that had more female partners than average. Or men or women weren't telling the truth. So what they did is they set up another condition. In this condition, same survey, but they're asked anonymously. Just here's a survey, fill it out. No one's going to know what your results are. They can't tie the results to you. No one's going to assess this. In this group, men reported 4.2 sexual partners on average, while women reported 3.4. So in the previous condition, men reported a half of an average sexual partner, women reported 0.8 additional sexual partners. And then they did this final condition where they hooked men and women up to fake lie detector tests, basically. They can't, lie detectors don't work. They can't really assess if someone's lying or not, but some people think they work. And if you're hooked up to a lie detector and you think it works, you might be more inclined to tell the truth. And so what happened in this condition, when you're asked the same questions while you're hooked up to this fake lie detector, men report on average about 4 sexual partners, and women reported 4.4. So here's the number that men report. When someone might find out, 3.7, anonymously 4.2, and hooked up to a fake lie detector test, 4. So on average, men are reporting about 4 sexual partners, give or take, some natural variation across these samples. Women, when someone might find out, reported 2.6, anonymously 3.4, hooked up to a fake lie detector, 4.4. So across these conditions, men were reporting a relatively stable number of sexual partners, while it seemed women were underreporting when they were asked in a more public fashion. And given what we just reviewed about how men put a premium on sexual fidelity in prospective partners to a greater degree than women, it's not surprising that you see some difficulty in studying this topic openly and honestly, because some people are going to be inclined to exaggerate the features that the other sex finds attractive. And lest you think that I'm getting down on women here, when it comes to dating sites, you also have things like men will exaggerate their height. Men will exaggerate their earning potential because they believe women value these things, and they believe so correctly. So the sexes are to some extent trying to deceive each other, and in short-term contexts where mating can get rather heated, there is some difficulty in studying this. Indeed, when Kinsey was doing his early studies into sexuality, really opening up the field, metaphorically, of course, one of the reasons that a lot of people refused to take his part in his studies, or questions they refused to answer the most, were questions about whether they had sexual affairs. It's a difficult topic to study. Now, interestingly, male physiology, our bodies, do speak to the existence of short-term mating in human history. Specifically, I wanted to consider the size of male testicles. So as we should all appreciate, the testicles of males are the organs that are producing the sex cells, the gametes, in this case, sperm, and there's also some seminal fluid that goes along with the sperm. The larger the testicles of an animal, the more sperm it should be capable of producing. Now, while sperm production itself might be a relatively minor investment in reproduction compared to female pregnancy, sperm are still metabolically costly to produce. No such thing as a free lunch. And an evolutionary process would not favor a male physiology that produced far more sperm than was required when that energy and resources can be spent better elsewhere. There's no point in producing a gallon of sperm if a teaspoon will do. So accordingly, we can think about why males might want to produce more sperm, and one answer comes from contexts which are known as sperm competition. As the name implies, sperm competition occurs when sperm from multiple males, 2 or more, are present in a female reproductive tract at the same time, and the sperm from these different males are competing to fertilize the same egg. So you have 2 or more males contributing sperm, only one of them is going to fertilize the egg, or if there are multiple eggs, a larger share of those eggs. This is why it's called sperm competition. We might predict then that males who produce more sperm are more likely to win this competition relative to those that have fewer competitors in the game. So if you're a species that happens to rarely, if ever, face sperm competition, you would expect that the males produce less sperm because you only need to produce as many as you need to reliably fertilize an egg. But if you're a species that faces a lot of sperm competition, you probably want to get selected to produce more sperm to maximize your chances of winning that race. So as such, interestingly enough, the size of a male's testicles, as a percentage of their overall body size, because obviously larger animals have larger everything, the larger your testicles relative to your body size is a biological cue to the degree of sperm competition that took place in your species' evolutionary history. So, if we look at our humans and our closest primate relatives on this evolutionary tree, we see a very interesting pattern. On one side of the spectrum, you have gorillas. These gorillas, despite having rather large bodies, males have the smallest relative testicle size. That is, a male gorilla testicle, it's going to account for about 0.02% of their overall body mass. And these relatively small testicles correspond to a gorilla's mating system, which tends to be the case where you have a single dominant male that has access to all the female gorillas in his vicinity, and they will physically remove rival males. And because of this, gorillas face little, if any, sperm competition from rivals. And so they have very small testicles relative to their body. Humans, by contrast, have testicles that account for 0.08% of our overall body mass, which, while still small, is about 4 times the relative size of a gorilla's. Now, human mating systems depart from that of the gorillas, where human males often live in multi-male groups, and there's this possibility of rival males mating with your partner, or 2 or more males mating with a short-term partner. And this is where sperm competition can rear its head. The opportunities for it increase. So you have gorillas at about 0.02. You have humans at about 0.08, about 4 times higher. And then on the higher end of the spectrum, we have chimpanzees, which you actually see here. This is a picture of a chimpanzee testicle and a chimpanzee brain, relative size. A chimpanzee has a testicle that accounts for about 0.27% of its body, which is more than 3 times that of humans and more than 10 times that of gorillas. Unsurprisingly, chimpanzees are known for their highly promiscuous sexual behavior, living in multi-male groups. When females enter estrus, they tend to mate with many, many different males. And as such, there's a lot of sperm competition that's going on. And, accordingly, chimpanzees invest far more physiologically in the size of their testicles so they can produce more sperm so they can win this race. Now, while this doesn't yield many specific predictions about the precise degree of sperm competition that exists in humans, in terms of all short-term mating, it does provide a general suggestion, which is that humans encounter more sperm competition over our evolutionary history than gorillas, and we also encounter far less of it than chimpanzees do. And so the likely presence of cues of ancestral sperm competition tells the tale at least of occasional short-term mating that happens in humans. A related finding, which I'm sure is incredibly difficult to obtain, involves the amount of sperm a man produces during any given bout of sex with his partner. The sperm count in the ejaculate. Now, as you understand, this is probably a difficult topic to study, but sometimes it does indeed get studied. And when researchers have been lucky and capable enough to obtain sperm samples from sexual encounters between couples, this is collected usually via one of 2 ways, either from condoms or from what's referred to as flowback, which is the amount of seminal fluid that is spontaneously expelled from a woman after sex. They don't retain everything you ejaculate inside of them. If you can obtain this seminal fluid sample either from the flowback or from a condom, you can assess the sperm count in the sample. And what they find when they do this research is that the number of sperm, the amount of sperm in a man's ejaculate, appears to correlate positively with the length of separation from his partner. That is, how much time do you spend apart from each other? In this case, men who spend close to about 100% of their time with their partner in their daily lives, they tend to produce about 390, roughly 400 million sperm per ejaculate. And when that amount of time they spend around each other as a percentage of your day falls to about 5%, the number almost doubles to about 712 million. So about 390 to 712. And that men appear to produce and ejaculate more sperm as their time apart from their partner increases, at least appears consistent with this idea that there are some physiological adaptations that exist in humans, specifically males, to combat the adaptive problem of possible sperm competition. That is, the less time you spend around your partner, the less time you are engaged in what are called mate guarding behaviors or monitoring, the greater the probability that this partner may have had an affair with somebody else. And so what you do, it seems, is that you produce more sperm to combat this risk rather than the same amount that you usually would. And also, for what it's worth, the extent of human short-term mating is somewhat underestimated by sperm competition. That is, not all short-term encounters that humans have take place where a female is mating with multiple males in a short period of time. There are plenty of short-term encounters where a female is just mating with one male. They're just not in a relationship. So the adaptations for sperm competition, to some extent, underestimate the amount of actual short-term mating that takes place. Again, it seems a lot more than gorillas and quite a bit less than chimpanzees. There's another physiological adaptation that appears to have its roots in encouraging short-term encounters. And this is what's known as the Coolidge effect. Coolidge effect was named after a fun story about a former U.S. president, seen here, Calvin Coolidge. Whether it's true or not, no one really knows, but it's fun to talk about all the same. And as the story goes, Mr. and Mrs. Coolidge, who you see here, are going on a tour to a government-run farm. And they are being given separate tours of the farm. See how it operates, talk to people there, president stuff. On the first tour, the farm supervisor takes Mrs. Coolidge past the chickens. And as they are moving past the chicken enclosure, Mrs. Coolidge notices a rooster that is mating rather vigorously with a hen, really going at it. And she's so impressed by this display that she turns to the supervisor and asks, "Goodness, does the hen always act like this?" And the supervisor replies, "Yeah, that's totally normal. Hen does that, the rooster does that many times a day." And Miss Coolidge said, "Okay, when you're giving the tour to my husband, could you please let him know about that?" So, as the second tour is happening later, and the farm supervisor is giving Mr. Coolidge the tour, they again pass the chickens, and the supervisor tells Mr. Coolidge what his wife said. The president stops and thinks about this for a minute, and then he turns to the supervisor and asks him, "Does the rooster always mate with the same hen every time?" And the supervisor says, "Oh, no, it's pretty much a different hen every time." And the president says, "Well, please tell that to my wife." So the Coolidge effect here, this refers to the typical male response to sexually novel partners that you see in many species. Specifically, if you have a male and a female in the same enclosure, and you give the male an opportunity to mate with the female, a receptive female, the male does it, you see this initial very large burst of sexual activity, and that's followed by a decline into an eventual disinterest. That is, the male will stop mating with that partner. And it happens usually in a relatively short amount of time. If, however, you take that female partner out and you place a partner that the male hasn't mated with before in the enclosure, you will see a reactivation of this arousal and sexual response. Each time the male is presented with a novel female, you'll see this burst in sexual activity. But if you take a female out and then put the same female back in, you see a continued disinterest. And the underlying logic here is that each new female provides a new opportunity to reproduce, while a female that's already been inseminated provides a much steeper diminishing return for each additional mating act. If you already impregnated a female, you can't get her more pregnant. But a novel female, you can get a new one pregnant each time. And this is why you see this burst of reproductive behavior with new females. So in the realm of behavior, this psychological mechanism that's aroused by novel partners can be seen in several realms. What behaviors does this encourage? First, there's the thing called the refractory period, which is that after a man reaches orgasm, there is this point where future arousal becomes unpleasant or even impossible, become too sensitive physically, you are unable to maintain an erection. As Austin Powers here puts it, it's the feeling of being spent. And this refractory period likely exists, at least in part, as some type of motivational adaptation to place your efforts where they're better spent. If you've just inseminated a mate, the benefits to immediately inseminating that particular mate again falls off greatly. So even though a man might be consciously interested in continuing to have sex because it feels good for the partner or because it feels good for them, there are other mechanisms that appear to counteract this and disable the arousal response. And it's also possible this Coolidge effect results in behaviors that cause people to seek out novel partners. So it's been reported, in general, of course, that men both desire more sexual partners than women. Men want a greater number of different sexual partners than women, and men tend to pursue affairs when they're in a relationship more often than women do. In one such study, conducted with American college students, when you ask them how many sexual partners you would like to have over the next X amount of time, how many sexual partners do you want in the next week, in the next month, in the next year, questions like that, at every time interval, men indicate wanting a greater number of female partners than women report wanting male partners. So, for instance, in the next year, it was reported that women only reported wanting one additional partner, whereas men reported wanting about 6. Over a lifetime, women reported wanting about 4 different partners, while men reported 18. It's this desire for sexual novelty. And unsurprisingly, when it comes to sexual fantasies, things people actually think of, men tend to think about sex more often than women. They tend to think about having sex with more partners than women. And this is it's a very funny thing to think about. Men, even sometimes when they're having a sexual fantasy, will switch partners in the middle of their sexual fantasy. Men like sexual variety so much, they'll imagine thinking about having sex with one woman, and before they're done with that sexual fantasy, they've already imagined having sex with a different one. Further, these male sexual fantasies also focus on visual imagery more so than women. That is, female sexual fantasies, they tend to focus on existing or known partners, someone you're in a relationship with, someone you'd like to be in a relationship with, rather than strangers. Men tend to fantasize about having sex with relative strangers all the time. Women tend to focus more on the emotional or personality features of the person they're having sex with. That is, women tend to focus more on how they would be feeling during this fantasy, whereas men tend to focus more on sheer physical hedonistic pleasure. And when men are fantasizing, they're also focusing more on this short-term physical, well, I guess not really. In some, men are thinking about this short-term physical gratification with a variety of partners, and women are more focused on this long-term emotional gratification from known individuals. There's not variation in this, of course. Sometimes there are women that fantasize about having sex with multiple partners. Sometimes there are men that fantasize about having sex with specific ones with great regularity. But the general pattern is always clear. Men are thinking about having sex with more people, more often, in a more physical, visual way than women. Women tend to focus on fewer people and longer-term relationships and feelings instead of physical gratification. Additionally, as I just mentioned, men also seek out affairs more often than women as well. While the frequency of how often you seek out affairs is going to vary from time to place, given how local contexts can encourage or discourage short-term mating, it seems to be the case that men seek out affairs in relationships, on average, either as often as women or about twice as often as women, in that range. Either men and women seek out affairs as often, or men have affairs about twice as often. And this is because, as we reviewed before, men can benefit more from the sheer number of sexual partners they can access relative to women, and this can really promote adaptations for more of a roving eye in men. Always sizing up how many other opportunities you have. Where are they? Can I get them now? And as such, it should really come as no surprise here that men are far more likely to pay for access for sexual encounters when it comes to prostitutes relative to women. Men are both more likely to have paid for a prostitute at any point in their life than women, and they're also more likely to have paid for prostitutes consistently than women are. Indeed, as many women who have used online dating apps can tell you, you don't need to go very far if you're a woman if you want to find male attention in general. If you want to find a man, you can probably do that as a woman. In fact, you're probably going to be flooded with opportunities that you don't want. So, perhaps it's difficult for women to obtain attention from a specific partner that they might desire, but if a woman wants to find a man, just any man to have sex with, she usually can. And for women, this obviously means that prostitution is simply a much worse value proposition. Why am I going to pay for this thing that I am getting constantly for free and don't want? By contrast, as any man who has used a dating app can tell you, attracting the attention of a partner, any partner in the first place, can be a task that for some feels nearly impossible. And this makes the idea of simply paying for the sexual encounter quite a bit more appealing. So that's all I got for you now. Next time we're going to consider more about what women get from short-term mating. We're going to move into discussions of the homosexuality preference and why that might exist. And this is going to let us segue nicely into topics of morality surrounding sexuality, and then into the topic of morality more generally, and understanding what that is.